Did medieval convents, those quiet havens of piety and prayer, truly offer sanctuary from the deadliest forces of the age? Were the stone walls and fervent prayers enough to ward off the invisible horrors that stalked the medieval world, or did they become unwitting traps for their devoted residents? The answers, drawn from the shadowed depths of history, suggest a more terrifying reality for nuns living between the years 500 and 1500 AD. Number 1. Smallpox. Smallpox, a name that strikes fear even in modern times, was a relentless and widespread terror throughout the medieval period, a true scourge upon humanity, and no less so within the supposedly protective confines of a convent. This highly contagious disease, caused by the variola virus, was a familiar and dreaded guest in every corner of the known world, striking indiscriminately at young and old, rich and poor, layperson and cloistered religious alike. For the nuns, living in close proximity within their dormitories, chapels, and refectories, smallpox represented an almost unstoppable force of infection, a wildfire ready to consume their community once it gained even the slightest foothold. The early signs of smallpox were often insidious, deceptively mimicking other less severe ailments, which only served to delay recognition and containment, allowing the virus to spread stealthily amongst the unsuspecting sisters. A nun might first complain of a sudden searing fever, a relentless headache that pounded behind her eyes, and a profound, debilitating fatigue that made even the simplest tasks feel like monumental efforts. Her back might ache with a deep, persistent pain, and she might experience bouts of vomiting or a general feeling of unease and malaise. These initial symptoms, resembling a common fever, could be easily dismissed, leading to a delay in isolating the infected sister, a critical oversight in the tightly woven fabric of convent life. Within a few days, however, the true horror of smallpox would begin to manifest, unmistakable and terrifying. A rash, initially appearing as small flat red spots, would erupt across the nun's face, then rapidly spread to her limbs and the rest of her body. These spots were not merely superficial, they quickly transformed, evolving into raised bumps that swelled with fluid, becoming distinct, round pustules, each one a miniature, grotesque sphere of disease. These pustules were intensely itchy, driving the afflicted nun to an agony of scratching, and their sheer number could be overwhelming, covering virtually every inch of her skin, including the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet. As these pustules matured, they became increasingly painful, throbbing with an internal pressure, and often merging together, particularly on the face, to form larger, disfiguring lesions. The suffering endured by a nun afflicted with smallpox was immense, extending far beyond the visible lesions. The fever would often spike to dangerous levels, leaving her delirious, her mind clouded by the viral assault. Her throat might become swollen and sore, making swallowing an agonizing ordeal, leading to dehydration and malnutrition. The pustules in her mouth and throat would cause internal discomfort, adding to the general misery. As the disease progressed, the pustules would eventually dry up, forming thick, dark scabs. While this phase might signal the beginning of recovery for some, for many, it marked a new stage of torment. The scabs, when they eventually fell off, would leave behind deep-pitted scars, the characteristic pockmarks that forever marked a survivor of smallpox, a visible testament to the disease's brutal passage. These scars were not merely cosmetic. They could be a constant reminder of the pain and the brush with death, forever altering a nun's appearance, and perhaps her self-perception within a community where physical perfection was often idealized, or at least expected to be unmarred. For the sisters who survived smallpox, the journey was far from over. Beyond the physical scarring, many suffered from permanent complications. Blindness was a tragic and all too common outcome, as the pustules could form on the cornea of the eye, leading to irreversible damage. Joint pain, swelling, and even limb deformities were also reported, making daily tasks and devotional practices incredibly challenging. The very essence of convent life, which relied on communal participation in prayer, labor, and study, would be severely disrupted by the debilitation of its members. A nun who became blind could no longer read her breviary or assist with detailed needlework. Her contributions to the convent's practical and spiritual life fundamentally altered. The spread of smallpox within a convent was almost inevitable once it was introduced. Nuns slept in large dormitories, often with beds in close proximity. They ate their meals together in the refectory, sharing utensils and breaking bread from common loaves. They worshipped side by side in the chapel, breathing the same air, singing from shared hymnals. The very acts of communal living central to the monastic ideal became vectors for disease transmission. Furthermore, the role of certain nuns, particularly the infirmarian sisters who cared for the sick, inadvertently placed them at the highest risk of infection. With no understanding of germ theory, these compassionate caregivers would touch, tend to, and comfort their ailing sisters, unaware that every close interaction, every shared breath in a confined space was a pathway for the variola virus to jump from one host to the next. The constant flow of necessary goods and occasional visitors, such as priests, masons, or merchants, also posed a risk, as they could unknowingly carry the virus into the cloistered world. A new postulant, fresh from the outside world, could unknowingly bring the disease with her, an invisible harbinger of death to her new spiritual family. The medieval understanding of smallpox was predictably mired in a mixture of superstition, rudimentary observation, and a profound lack of scientific insight. It was often viewed as a divine punishment for sin, a test of faith, or the work of malevolent forces. The concept of contagion, while vaguely understood, was not attributed to microscopic organisms, but to corrupted air, known as miasma, or to an imbalance of the four humors within the body. Treatments were therefore ineffective at best, and often actively harmful. Bleeding, purging, and the application of various poultices made from herbs, animal parts, or even human excrement were common practices. Charms, amulets, and fervent prayers were often seen as equally, if not more potent defenses against the disease's onslaught. Nuns would undoubtedly spend hours in prayer, invoking saints known for healing, perhaps Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian, believing that spiritual intercession was their most powerful weapon against the invisible enemy. The impact of a smallpox outbreak on a medieval convent was utterly devastating, sometimes leading to the complete decimation of the community. Records from the era, though fragmented, hint at convents losing a significant proportion of their members in a single epidemic. The loss of nuns, particularly those with specialized skills like reading, copying manuscripts, managing accounts, or overseeing the infirmary, would cripple the convent's ability to function. The daily round of prayers, the Opus Dei, the very heart of monastic life, would be disrupted as sisters succumbed to illness, too weak to attend services or even to rise from their beds. The economic stability of the convent, often reliant on the labor of its sisters or the endowments brought by new recruits, would suffer immensely. Fewer hands meant less work done, fewer able-bodied sisters to maintain the property or manage its agricultural holdings. The spiritual morale of the remaining sisters would also be profoundly tested. How could God allow such suffering among His most devoted servants? Was their faith insufficient? Was the convent itself cursed? These profound questions would undoubtedly weigh heavily on the minds of those who survived. Shaping their future piety and outlook, burial practices would also be grimly altered. With so many deaths, the usual solemn rituals would be hastened, bodies interred in mass graves. If the communal cemetery became overwhelmed, convents' silent grounds would echo with the absence of familiar voices, a pervasive silence replacing the hum of daily life. The lingering fear of recurrence, the knowledge that the world outside remained a source of potential reinfection, would cast a long shadow over the convent's recovery, making every new cough or fever a source of renewed dread. The memory of the smallpox plague would become an indelible part of the convent's history, a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability in the face of such a formidable and merciless foe. Number 2. Typhus. Typhus, often referred to as jail fever or camp fever, was another silent killer that relentlessly stalked the medieval world, thriving in conditions of poor hygiene, crowding, and human misery. This bacterial infection, primarily spread by body lice, represented a constant threat to communities where people lived in close quarters with limited access to sanitation, a description that tragically fit many medieval convents, though often overshadowed by the more dramatic and rapid devastation of the Black Death. Typhus was a persistent and insidious killer, capable of wiping out significant portions of a population over a longer drawn-out period, gnawing away at the strength and vitality of a cloistered community. The journey of typhus within a human body was a tormenting and debilitating one. It typically began subtly, with a sudden onset of high fever, often accompanied by a severe headache that could feel like a vice tightening around the skull. A nun might experience profound muscle aches and joint pains, making every movement a source of discomfort. Weakness would quickly set in, often leading to extreme prostration, rendering her unable to perform her daily duties or even attend prayers. After a few days, the disease would reveal its telltale sign, a characteristic rash that erupted on the torso and then spread outwards to the extremities, though it typically spared the face, palms, and soles of the feet. This rash often appeared as small, pinkish-red spots that did not blanch when pressed, a distinctive feature that medieval physicians, if they were astute observers, might have noted. As the disease progressed, these spots could become darker, turning reddish-brown, and sometimes developing into larger bruise-like lesions. This rash was often accompanied by delirium, a terrifying symptom where the nun's mind would wander filled with vivid hallucinations, paranoid thoughts, or an inability to recognize her fellow sisters or even her own surroundings. She might mutter incoherently, shout out names, or stare blankly into space, her internal world consumed by the fever's heat. The advanced stages of typhus were particularly brutal. The high fever could persist for weeks, leading to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. The delirium would often intensify, transitioning into a stupor or even a coma, leaving the afflicted nun unresponsive to the world around her. Heart complications were common, with the heart muscle itself becoming inflamed and weakened, leading to irregular heartbeats and eventual cardiac failure. Pneumonia, a common secondary infection in weakened individuals, often developed, filling the lungs with fluid and making breathing a desperate struggle. Gangrene could develop in the extremities, particularly the fingers and toes, due to compromised blood flow, leading to the chilling prospect of limb loss. Putrid smell of the sick room, filled with the stench of fever, sweat, and bodily fluids, would be a constant presence, a grim reminder of the disease's unrelenting grip. For a medieval convent, the presence of typhus was a sign of deeply rooted sanitary challenges. Body lice, the primary vectors of the disease, thrived in conditions where personal hygiene was difficult to maintain and where clothing was rarely washed or changed. Nuns, despite their spiritual devotion, often lived in conditions that facilitated louse infestation. Their habits and undergarments, though meant to be kept clean, were made of wool or coarse linen, often heavy and warm, providing ideal breeding grounds for lice. Regular bathing, by modern standards, was infrequent in medieval Europe, even in convents. While some convents might have had access to bathhouses, personal washing was often limited to sponging in cold water, and full immersion baths were a luxury or a rare event, particularly during colder months. The shared dormitories, where sisters slept in close proximity, allowed lice to easily transfer from one individual to another, spreading the infection rapidly. Even if one nun were meticulously clean, the close quarters meant she was still vulnerable to infestation from her neighbors. The economic implications for a convent grappling with typhus were severe. Unlike a quick epidemic like the plague, typhus often dragged on for weeks or months in individual cases, and the community outbreak could persist for a very long time, leading to a prolonged period of infirmity and reduced productivity. Nuns who survived were often left severely weakened and debilitated for an extended period, requiring care and unable to resume their full duties for months. This meant fewer hands to perform the myriad tasks necessary for the convent's survival: tending to gardens, preparing meals, copying manuscripts, weaving cloth, or caring for the sick. The economic self-sufficiency of the convent, already a precarious balance, would be severely threatened. Maintaining the convent's property, often extensive and requiring constant upkeep, would become nearly impossible with a depleted workforce. The spiritual and psychological toll of typhus on the nuns was profound. The prolonged suffering, the delirium, and the often gruesome end experienced by their sisters would have tested the very foundations of their faith. Constant fear of contagion, of being the next one to succumb, would have been a pervasive presence within the convent walls. The sight of a once vibrant sister succumbing to fever and delirium would be heartbreaking, especially when the cause was invisible and seemingly uncontrollable. The medieval understanding of typhus, like other diseases, was steeped in the belief of divine retribution or miasma. It was seen as a manifestation of an imbalance of the humors or a punishment for collective sins. Attempts at treatment were futile. Physicians might prescribe bloodletting, purgatives, or herbal concoctions, all of which had little to no effect on the bacterial infection and often weakened the already compromised patient. Prayers, fasting, and processions were often the primary interventions, desperate pleas for divine mercy in the face of an incomprehensible and relentless disease. The administrative stability of the convent also hung in the balance during a typhus outbreak. The abbess or prioress, the leaders of the community, fell ill or succumbed to the disease. It could throw the convent into chaos, disrupting its governance and decision-making processes. Succession would become a pressing issue, often decided in a climate of fear and uncertainty. The loss of older, experienced nuns who held the communal memory and knowledge of traditions, rituals, and practical skills would be particularly devastating, creating a vacuum that was difficult to fill with newly professed, less experienced sisters. The social fabric of the convent, built on bonds of sisterhood and shared devotion, would be strained by the constant presence of illness and death, fostering an atmosphere of pervasive fear and grief. The silent, unyielding grip of typhus left scars on the medieval convents. It touched not just on the bodies of its victims, but on the very soul of the community, forever altering its trajectory and leaving a grim legacy of suffering and loss. The resilience of those who endured such periods stands as a testament to their unwavering faith and perhaps to the simple human will to survive against overwhelming odds. Number 3. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was grimly known in the medieval era, was a chronic, insidious killer, a disease that gnawed away at the vitality of its victims over months or even years. Unlike the explosive outbreaks of plague or smallpox, tuberculosis was a slow burn, a persistent shadow that lurked in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, steadily claiming lives in weakening communities. For the nuns in medieval convents, who often lived in close proximity within stone walls that could be damp and lacking in fresh air, tuberculosis was an ever-present menace, a silent companion that slowly extinguished the light of life within their pious walls. The onset of consumption was often deceptively mild, making it difficult to identify in its early stages and contributing to its relentless spread. A nun might first complain of a persistent cough, initially dry and irritating, but gradually becoming more productive, bringing up phlegm. She might experience a low-grade fever that waxed and waned particularly in the afternoons, and night sweats so profuse they would drench her wimple and habit, leaving her chilled and exhausted. Fatigue, a profound and debilitating weariness, would become her constant companion, making even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. She might lose her appetite, leading to a gradual and alarming weight loss, giving her the gaunt, wasted appearance that lent the disease its dreaded name, consumption. As tuberculosis progressed, its symptoms became more horrifying and unmistakable. The cough would worsen, becoming hacking and persistent, often accompanied by chest pain that grew sharper with each breath. Bloody sputum, expelled with each cough, was a terrifying sign, indicating the destruction of lung tissue. Breathing would become increasingly labored, leading to shortness of breath. Even at rest, the nun's skin might take on a pale, almost translucent quality, while her lips and nail beds might turn bluish due to lack of oxygen. For some, the disease would spread beyond the lungs, manifesting in other parts of the body. Tuberculosis of the spine, known as Pott's disease, could cause severe back pain, deformities, and even paralysis. Tuberculosis of the joints, particularly the hips and knees, would lead to excruciating pain and limited mobility, making it impossible for a nun to kneel for prayer or walk unaided. Glandular tuberculosis could cause swollen lymph nodes, particularly in the neck, sometimes erupting into painful, draining lesions. The sheer variety of its manifestations made it a chameleon of disease, often baffling medieval observers. The conditions within medieval convents inadvertently created ideal breeding grounds for the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria. Nuns lived, prayed, and slept in close proximity, sharing dormitories that were often unheated or poorly heated, leading to dampness and cold. Ventilation, often limited by the architectural design of thick stone walls and small windows, meant that airborne droplets from an infected nun's cough could linger suspended in the cool, still air and be easily inhaled by her sisters. Communal lifestyle, central to monastic life, facilitated the spread of the disease. Shared cups for water or wine, shared linens, communal dining tables, and close physical proximity during rituals and daily chores all served as pathways for transmission. A single infected nun unknowingly shedding bacteria for months or even years before her symptoms became severe could slowly but steadily infect an entire community. The diet of medieval nuns, while providing sustenance, could sometimes contribute to their vulnerability. Depending on the wealth of the convent, the diet could be monotonous and deficient in essential nutrients. While some convents had access to a varied diet including fresh vegetables, fruits, and dairy products, others, particularly poorer establishments, might rely heavily on bread, legumes, and salted fish, lacking the vitamins and minerals necessary to bolster the immune system. A weakened immune system, whether from poor nutrition or the constant strain of religious life, would make a nun more susceptible to contracting tuberculosis and less likely to recover. The impact of tuberculosis on a medieval convent was profound and long-lasting, a slow erosion rather than a sudden cataclysm. Chronic nature of the disease meant that sisters would be ill for extended periods, requiring constant care from the infirmarian nuns. This placed an immense burden on the healthy sisters, who had to balance their own devotional duties with the demanding task of nursing their ailing companions. The physical toll on the caregivers themselves was immense, leading to exhaustion and, tragically, often to their own infection. The slow loss of members to consumption meant a gradual depletion of the convent's workforce and spiritual strength. Unlike the mass deaths of plague, where replacements might be sought quickly, tuberculosis deaths were spaced out, creating a continuous drain on resources and morale. Constant presence of illness and death would cast a pall over the convent, a pervasive sense of dread and resignation. The medieval understanding of tuberculosis was as shrouded in mystery as its onset. It was often attributed to a weakness of the lungs, a coldness or dampness in the body, or an imbalance of the humors. Some believed it was hereditary, a family curse. Superstition also played a role, with some attributing it to witchcraft or divine displeasure. Treatments were largely ineffective and often based on unproven remedies. Herbal concoctions, often purgatives or emetics, were administered to cleanse the body. Rest, fresh air, and a nourishing diet were sometimes prescribed, a rare instance where medieval practice aligned with modern understanding, though often inconsistently applied. Prayers, pilgrimages, and the intercession of saints were also heavily relied upon, particularly Saint Francis, who was associated with healing the sick. Nuns would often resort to spiritual remedies, believing that fervent devotion might stave off the inevitable or grant a miraculous recovery. The spiritual and emotional toll on the nuns who watched their sisters waste away was immense. The slow decline, the persistent cough, the agonizing struggle for breath, and the ultimate, often lingering death would be deeply traumatizing. The sight of a once vibrant and active sister reduced to a skeletal, breathless invalid, unable to participate in the communal life of the convent, would challenge their faith and their understanding of suffering. The perpetual presence of sickness could lead to a pervasive sense of helplessness and resignation, as they saw one sister after another succumb to the same fate. For the individual nun afflicted, the isolation, the constant pain, and the slow march towards death would be a terrifying and lonely journey. The awareness of their own physical decay, even as their spiritual devotion remained strong, would be a profound test. Tuberculosis, the slow-acting killer, left convents not just with empty cells and fewer hands for labor, but with a deep, enduring wound on their collective spirit, a testament to the quiet, agonizing battles fought within their solemn walls against an unseen, unrelenting enemy. Chronic nature of the disease meant that a convent might never fully recover from its grip, continually losing members and struggling to maintain its numbers and its vibrancy across generations. Number 4. Dysentery. Dysentery, commonly known as the bloody flux in medieval times, was a terrifying and highly prevalent disease that swept through communities with devastating speed, leaving a trail of suffering and death in its wake. This severe infection of the intestines caused by various bacteria or amoebae was intrinsically linked to poor sanitation and contaminated food or water, conditions that were unfortunately common in many medieval settings, including convents. While not always as instantly fatal as the plague, dysentery could quickly debilitate and kill, especially the young, the old, and those already weakened by other ailments or insufficient nutrition. For the nuns, living in enclosed communities with shared facilities, a single case of dysentery could rapidly escalate into a full-blown epidemic, threatening the very survival of their spiritual family. The onset of dysentery was often sudden and dramatic. A nun might experience intense abdominal cramps, sharp and searing pains that twisted her gut, quickly followed by an urgent and overwhelming need to evacuate her bowels. The diarrhea that ensued was not merely watery. It was often mixed with blood, mucus, and pus, a horrifying sight that immediately signaled the severity of the infection. Each bowel movement would bring further cramps and a debilitating weakness. Constant loss of fluids and electrolytes from the body led to rapid dehydration, a life-threatening complication. A nun suffering from dysentery would develop a parched mouth, sunken eyes, and skin that lost its elasticity, becoming dry and inelastic. Her thirst would be unbearable, yet drinking too much often led to immediate expulsion. Beyond the immediate bowel symptoms, dysentery brought a host of other debilitating and terrifying manifestations. A high fever was a common companion, soaring to dangerous levels and leaving the nun delirious and disoriented. Nausea and vomiting were also frequent, further contributing to dehydration and making it nearly impossible to keep down food or even water. Constant straining during bowel movements could lead to rectal prolapse, a painful and horrifying condition where the rectum protrudes from the anus. In severe cases, the infection could spread beyond the intestines, leading to sepsis, a systemic infection that could cause organ failure and rapid death. Pain, weakness, and constant need to rush to the latrine would render a nun utterly incapacitated, unable to participate in any aspect of convent life, her days consumed by relentless suffering. The stench of the illness, pervasive and sickening, would permeate the infirmary, a grim reminder of the bodily breakdown occurring within. The conditions in medieval convents, despite their ordered routines, often fostered the spread of dysentery. Water sources, whether wells, rivers, or cisterns, could easily become contaminated by human or animal waste. If a convent's latrines were not properly constructed or maintained, or if they were too close to the water supply, the risk of contamination was exceptionally high. Food preparation practices also played a critical role. If hands were not thoroughly washed before handling food, or if food was not cooked properly, or if it was stored in unsanitary conditions, bacteria could proliferate and be ingested. Communal eating with shared serving dishes, communal water pitchers, and perhaps even shared eating utensils meant that if one person was infected, the bacteria could easily be transferred to others. The very closeness of convent life, usually a source of strength and comfort, became a vulnerability in the face of waterborne or foodborne pathogens. Even the simple act of a fly landing on contaminated waste and then on food could act as a vector, an unseen threat in their environment. The rapid spread of dysentery within a convent could quickly overwhelm its capacity to care for the sick. Unlike chronic diseases, dysentery could strike many sisters simultaneously, turning the infirmary into a scene of desperate suffering. The healthy nuns would be stretched to their limits, not only trying to care for their gravely ill sisters, but also attempting to maintain their own duties and prevent further infection. The sheer volume of sick individuals would exhaust resources from clean linens to what few medicinal herbs or treatments were available. The deaths could come swiftly, leading to a sudden and significant depletion of the convent's population. The medieval understanding of dysentery, like other diseases, was often based on the miasma theory, where foul odors or corrupted air were believed to cause illness. It was also attributed to an imbalance of the humors, particularly an excess of black bile or yellow bile. Treatments were largely ineffective and sometimes harmful. Bloodletting, purges, and enemas were common, often further dehydrating an already weakened patient. Herbal remedies such as astringents or soothing concoctions might have offered some minor symptomatic relief, but did nothing to address the underlying bacterial or amoebic infection. Prayers, fasting, and the invocation of saints, particularly Saint Lawrence and Saint Anthony, were often the only recourse, desperate pleas for divine intervention against an invisible and seemingly unstoppable force. The impact of a dysentery outbreak on a medieval convent was devastating, both in terms of human life and the functioning of the community. The sudden loss of many sisters could leave profound gaps in the convent's ranks, impacting everything from the daily recitation of the divine office to the management of its estates. If the abbess or key administrative nuns succumbed, the convent's leadership could be thrown into disarray. The economic life of the convent, reliant on the labor of its members, would suffer greatly. Fields might lie untended, crafts unmade, and administrative tasks undone. The spiritual morale of the remaining sisters would be profoundly shaken. The sight of so much suffering, the rapid deaths, and the horrifying nature of the disease could lead to intense grief, despair, and existential questioning. Was this a test from God? Was it a punishment? Convents that survived such outbreaks would bear the scars of loss and trauma, haunted by the memory of the bloody flux and the sisters it claimed. The recovery would be slow and arduous, requiring new recruits to fill the empty cells and a renewed effort to rebuild the community, often under the lingering shadow of fear of a future outbreak. The constant awareness of the precariousness of life, even within their hallowed walls, would leave an indelible mark on the survivors and shape the convent's future practices and prayers. Number 5. The Plague. The Black Death, known in medieval Europe simply as the Plague, was a cataclysmic force that reshaped the continent, claiming an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of its entire population in the mid-14th century and periodically returning in subsequent waves. For medieval convents, these waves of plague were not just a remote threat. They were an apocalyptic reality, a direct assault on their very existence, capable of wiping out entire communities of devoted nuns in a matter of weeks, leaving behind silence and desolation where once there was fervent prayer and communal life. The plague, primarily caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, manifested in several horrifying forms, each more terrifying than the last. The most common was bubonic plague, characterized by the sudden onset of a high fever, often accompanied by chills, muscle aches, and profound fatigue so deep it could render a nun unable to move. Within days, the telltale sign would appear: swollen, intensely painful lymph nodes called buboes, typically appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck areas where lymph nodes are clustered. These buboes could grow to the size of an apple or an egg, becoming hot, tender, and often turning a dark, bruised, purplish black. Hence the name Black Death. The pain from these swellings was excruciating, a constant throbbing agony that left the afflicted nun screaming in torment. Beyond the buboes, the plague often brought other terrifying symptoms. Hemorrhages under the skin would cause dark purplish spots and blotches to appear, contributing to the black appearance. Vomiting and diarrhea were common, further weakening the body. Delirium and confusion were almost universal, as the infection overwhelmed the nervous system, leaving the nun in a feverish, agitated state, muttering incoherently or struggling against unseen tormentors. In many cases, the buboes would burst, releasing putrid pus and a foul odor, but this often provided little relief as the systemic infection continued its deadly march. Even more terrifying were the other forms of plague. Pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs, was highly contagious, spreading directly from person to person through airborne droplets when an infected nun coughed or sneezed. Its onset was rapid, with severe pneumonia, coughing, and blood-tinged sputum, leading to death within a day or two. Septicemic plague, where the bacteria overwhelmed the bloodstream, could also occur, leading to widespread internal bleeding, organ failure, and rapid death even before buboes had a chance to form. These forms meant that the plague was not just a disease of rats and fleas, but a direct and terrifying threat that could spread through the very air within the closed confines of a convent. The spread of plague within a medieval convent was tragically efficient. Once the disease entered the convent walls, brought in perhaps by a new novice, a visiting priest, or even a tradesperson delivering supplies, its propagation was swift and merciless. Nuns slept in common dormitories, often side by side on straw mattresses. They shared meals in the refectory, ate from common trenchers, and drank from shared cups. They worshipped together in the chapel, in close, unventilated spaces, breathing the same air. The very communal nature of monastic life, designed for spiritual unity, became a conduit for contagion. The infirmarian sisters, charged with caring for the sick, were among the first and most frequent victims, their compassionate duties placing them in direct contact with the infected, ensuring the disease's continued spread within the convent. The rats and fleas that were ubiquitous in medieval buildings, even seemingly clean convents, also played their part, moving unseen through the walls and floors, carrying the deadly bacteria. The impact of the Black Death on medieval convents was utterly catastrophic, often leading to the complete annihilation of communities that had existed for centuries. Historical records, though sparse, frequently described convents where the entire population, or nearly all of it, perished within weeks. The loss of life was so rapid and extensive that the normal rituals of death and burial often had to be abandoned. Bodies would pile up in the infirmary or simply where they fell, waiting to be carted to mass graves dug in haste outside the convent walls. The spiritual heart of the convent, the daily rhythm of prayers, chants, and communal services, would grind to a halt as sisters fell ill and died. The silent chapels, once filled with devotion, became empty and echoing spaces, filled only with the faint moans of the dying. The economic devastation was profound. With no hands to labor, convents that relied on agricultural production, weaving, or manuscript copying for their income found their economic life shattered. Endowments dried up as benefactors died, and the very concept of a communal economy collapsed. The physical structures themselves, if left untended, would begin to decay, their windows shattering, their roofs leaking, their gardens overgrown, symbolizing the demise of the community within. The administrative structure of the convent would also disintegrate. Abbesses, prioresses, and other key leaders would succumb, leaving no one to manage the affairs, dispose of property, or even record the tragic events. The very legacy of the convent, its history and records, could be lost forever in the chaos and death. The psychological and spiritual toll on the surviving nuns, if any, was immense. To witness the rapid, agonizing deaths of all one's sisters, teachers, and friends, to hear the screams of pain and see the horrifying buboes would have been a deeply traumatic experience, challenging the very foundations of their faith. Was this divine wrath a test of unparalleled suffering? The sheer randomness of who lived and who died would have been incomprehensible. The fear of contagion, the constant dread of the telltale fever or swollen lymph node, would have been a pervasive presence for those few who lingered. Medieval understanding of the plague was entirely inadequate. It was attributed to a conjunction of planets, a corruption of the air, miasma, emanating from earthquakes or swamps, or most terrifyingly, divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Attempts at treatment were futile and often bizarre. Physicians, if they dared to approach the infected, might prescribe bloodletting, purging, or the application of foul-smelling poultices made from herbs, animal excrement, or even crushed precious stones. Amulets, prayers, flagellation, and processions were often the only solace sought, desperate pleas for mercy from a seemingly angry God. Church itself, the bedrock of medieval society, was profoundly shaken as its clergy, including priests and nuns, died in vast numbers while trying to administer last rites or care for the sick. For the convents that survived the initial onslaught of the Black Death, the recovery was a long and arduous process, sometimes spanning generations. Many convents struggled to attract new recruits, as the population had been decimated and the fear of future outbreaks lingered. The spiritual and intellectual life of the convent would be severely diminished, as the loss of experienced nuns meant the loss of knowledge, skills, and traditions. The memory of the plague would become an indelible part of the convent's history, a somber reminder of their profound vulnerability and the arbitrary cruelty of fate. The empty cells, the silent cloisters, and the overgrown gardens would serve as constant memorials to the sisters who vanished, leaving behind only their echoing absence in the desolate, plague-scarred landscape of medieval Europe.